The first thing Commander the Lyra Voss noticed was that the stars had gone still. Not dimmer. Not farther away. So. They hung outside the fractured canopy of her escape capsule like cold white nails hammered into black iron, hard and unmoving and utterly indifferent to the fact that an empire had just died around her. A ribbon of dark blood drifted from the cut above her brow, floating in slow red beads through the ruined cockpit before freezing against the inside of her visor in tiny crimson crystals. The life support console at her left elbow had gone from flashing warnings to emitting one thin, exhausted tone every 7 seconds, as if even the machine had accepted that panic was no longer useful. The Lyra tried to inhale and felt the air resist her. Too thin. Too cold. Almost gone. Below the dead alarms and failing systems, she could still hear the last sounds of the battle replaying in her head with the cruel clarity of fresh memory. The violent chatter of point defense cannons. The metallic groan of twisted hull plating. The final scream from the tactical board when the enemy flagship's spinal lance had punched straight through the heart of the Resolute and turned the bridge into a storm of white fire and shredded steel. That had been 12 minutes ago. Or 20. Or an hour. Time had broken apart after the command deck blew open. She closed her eyes for a moment and saw it again. The mining world of Kepri Station hanging beneath them, striped in gold and copper, its evacuation lanes packed with civilian transports too slow to outrun the Vraxian war swarm pouring out of the dark. Her cruisers repositioning to cover the retreat. The 7th Vanguard answering her commands without hesitation because they had followed her through blockade runs, dust sea bombardments, and 2 years of border collapse, and because they still believed that if Commander the Lyra Voss was standing on the bridge, then there was a path through any fire the galaxy could make. There had not been a path through this. The intelligence estimates had been wrong by an order of magnitude. What High Command had labeled a raiding force turned out to be a full eradication column. Not 10 heavy carriers. 40. Not escorts. Hive tenders. Siege wombs. Cutter screens so dense they had blotted out targeting solutions and turned open space into a moving wall of armored teeth. By the time the Lyra understood the scale of the trap, retreat had already become mathematics instead of strategy. She had done what commanders did when victory died first and duty remained behind to watch it. She split the fleet, burned the reserve drives, ordered every transport to dive for the outer lane, turned the 7th Vanguard broadside across the escape corridor and let the enemy crash into her like a tide against stone. For 6 minutes they held. 6 minutes of rail fire and collapsing shields. 6 minutes of crew reports read in voices trying not to shake. 6 minutes of watching ships with names and histories and people inside them become expanding halos of molten debris. The Indomitable went first, split clean through the center. Then the Far Spear. Then the old carrier Dawn Mercy, whose captain kept transmitting launch confirmations for civilian shuttles even after half his engines were gone and the port side of his hull was open to vacuum. She had heard him laugh once on a supply layover 3 winters ago. A huge laugh. Ridiculous. Human almost, though he wasn't. Now he was dust and ionized metal scattered somewhere behind her capsule. The Lyra's right hand twitched toward the dead weapons panel out of habit, still trying to command a ship that no longer existed. Nothing responded. The capsule rolled gently in the dark. A fracture line stretched across the main viewport. Beyond it, the battlefield drifted in ruin. Broken ships spun without purpose. Fires burned soundlessly in shattered wrecks. Fragments of the Resolute's outer armor turned slowly end over end, each one reflecting starlight with the calm beauty of things no longer connected to grief. Her fleet was gone. Kepri had fallen. And if the Vraxians reached the inner systems before the assembly understood what was really coming, then Kepri would not even matter. It would just be the first red mark on a map soon covered in them. The console emitted its thin tone again. 7 seconds. A new message blinked weakly across the failing display. Thermal regulation offline, oxygen reserve, critical core temp declining. Her people believed in the warrior passage. When battle ended and the body failed, the worthy dead crossed the glass river beneath the twin lights and entered the Hall of Names, where ancestors sat around endless fires and spoke of every stand worth remembering. The Lyra had spent most of her adult life privately suspecting that the Hall of Names was a story officers told recruits so they would fear dishonor more than pain. Now, alone in a freezing capsule with no engines, no signal, and no fleet left alive to hear one last order, she found herself hoping the old priests had not exaggerated. The cold moved deeper. Her fingers lost sensation first. Then her jaw. Then the muscles in her chest began to ache with the slow, terrible heaviness that came before they stopped obeying. She unsealed the collar clamp of her ruined command armor because it was pressing too hard against her throat. Frost crawled over the inside rim of the metal. She could no longer feel the wound in her side, which she knew was bad. Pain leaving before the body did was always bad. With effort, she raised one shaking hand to the broken visor and cleared a narrow patch of ice with her thumb. The stars still had not moved. Status, she whispered automatically because command had burrowed so deep into her bones that it reached for procedure even here. The capsule answered with silence. A laugh almost escaped her. Not from humor. From the strange absurdity of surviving long enough to become the only officer left to report to. She thought of her homeworld then. Not the Capitol towers. Not the victory parades. Not the polished halls of command. She thought of the white grasses near the inland cliffs where the wind bent them all in one direction at dusk. She thought of her father kneeling in the soil behind their old house, his hands black with earth, teaching her that roots survived storms by holding quietly and deeply, not by fighting the sky. She thought of her younger brother running down to the water with both sandals in one hand because he had never once in his life walked when he could run. Small things. The kind that returned at the end when all the grand ones had burned away. Her sight blurred. The warning tone did not come again. That frightened her more than the sound had. The cockpit darkened one system at a time until only the emergency strip over the hatch still glowed a dull red. Blood continued to freeze in the crack of her visor. Her breath came in shorter bursts now, pale and fading. Somewhere inside the armor over her chest, one of her two hearts stumbled, recovered, then slowed to an uneven, fragile beat. So this was it. Not on the bridge. Not with banners. Not in fire. In a drifting metal coffin on the edge of nowhere. The Lyra straightened as much as the harness would allow. Even now there were forms worth keeping. She pressed her numb fist over the center of her chest and spoke the death vow of the Solaran war lines, each word leaving her mouth in a white whisper. I stood. I held. I did not yield the dark and easy road. Her voice cracked on the last word. The red hatch light flickered once. Twice. Then it died. Absolute blackness swallowed the capsule. The cold wrapped itself around her like deep water. Her body went distant. Heavy. Then strangely light. Commander the Lyra Voss closed her eyes and waited for death to finish crossing the room. Death, the Lyra decided, was not behaving with proper military discipline. It was supposed to be cold. It was supposed to be silence and fading light and the final lonely arithmetic of a body shutting itself down in the dark. It was not supposed to smell like brown butter. That was the first thing that broke through. Not sight. Not thought. Smell. Rich, warm, impossible smell. Butter darkening in a hot pan. Roasted root vegetables. Something savory and sharp beneath it, maybe garlic, maybe pepper, maybe some spice she did not recognize because no battlefield in her experience had ever carried the aroma of someone making dinner. Then came sound. A low rhythmic clatter. Metal against wood. A knife perhaps. And underneath it, so soft she almost thought she imagined it, a voice humming tunelessly through a melody that rose and fell with the careless ease of someone entirely unworried by the possibility of war. The Lyra's eyes snapped open. Golden light greeted her. Not holy brilliance. Not ancestral fire. Late evening light, warm and low and imperfect, thrown in shifting bands across a ceiling made of heavy timber beams reinforced with narrow black metal ribs. The room was small enough to feel real, lived in rather than ceremonial. Stone walls. A narrow bookshelf crowded with physical books. A copper kettle hanging over a brick hearth where a real flame burned and cracked softly. Shadows moving on the walls with every flicker. She stared upward for 3 full breaths, waiting for the hallucination to reveal itself. It did not. Heat pressed gently against her skin through layers of thick woven blankets. Real weight. Real warmth. The mattress beneath her was firm but forgiving, nothing like a military bunk. Her armor was gone. So was the flight harness. So were her boots. She was dressed in a loose gray garment of rough but clean fabric that reached to her knees, and something tight was wrapped around her ribs and left side. Her body took inventory before her mind caught up. She was alive. The thought arrived not as relief, but as a sharp blade of alarm. She moved to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through her side so hard and bright that sparks burst at the edge of her vision. Her head swam. The room tilted. She caught herself on one elbow and sucked in air through clenched teeth. Warm air. Not filtered capsule residue. Not battle smoke. Air with moisture in it, touched by fire and food and wood and something green she could not yet name. A prisoner, she thought at once. The second thought came right behind it. Oh, her pod had been dead. Its hull had been breached. Its life support had failed. No distress beacon could have survived long enough to transmit through the debris field, and even if it had, no rescue vessel could have reached her before the cold did its work. Yet here she was in a bed under quilts while someone, somewhere just beyond the door, chopped vegetables and hummed to themselves as if plucking half-frozen enemy commanders out of vacuum were part of an ordinary schedule. The Lyra forced herself upright in increments. Sit. Pause. Breathe. Ignore the nausea. Continue. Her feet touched polished wood floorboards, cold but not cruelly so. The room smelled faintly of cedar and heated stone. There was a basin on a side table, fresh water beside it in a ceramic pitcher, and folded cloth bandages stacked with practical neatness. Whoever had put her here had not intended her to die slowly. That made them more dangerous, not less. She scanned for cameras, restraints, visible surveillance systems. None. That did not reassure her. Species advanced enough to extract a dying officer from a breached pod would hardly need visible monitoring to control a room. The humming continued outside, along with the steady chop, chop, chop of a blade moving with relaxed confidence. The Lyra stood. The first attempt nearly dropped her to one knee. Her legs remembered vacuum and shock trauma more clearly than her pride wished them to. She waited until the dizziness passed, one hand pressed flat to the bedpost, the other unconsciously seeking the sidearm that should have been holstered at her thigh. Gone. Of course it was gone. Her pulse quickened. She turned slowly in place, cataloging everything. Single bed. Stone hearth. One chair. One writing desk. One shuttered window glowing amber around the frame from light outside. A rug woven in dark geometric patterns she did not recognize. A narrow cabinet. No obvious weapons. Her eyes settled on the iron poker leaning beside the fireplace. Crude. Heavy. Imbalanced. Better than empty hands. The military part of her mind began reassembling itself around familiar tasks. Assess location. Assess captor. Recover weapons. Preserve command knowledge. Escape if possible. Kill if required. But beneath that disciplined process another, stranger truth kept intruding. The room was kind. She hated the word immediately. But the evidence was there all the same. The quilts had been layered to conserve heat around her core. The bandaging at her ribs was tight, skillful, and exactly where the old fracture line from a previous campaign always flared under stress. A cup sat cooling on the bedside table, some dark herbal brew perhaps, set within easy reach of a recovering patient rather than displayed for effect. Even the fire had been banked low and long, the way one kept a hearth stable through the night. This was not a cell. It was a recovery room. Which made no tactical sense. She moved toward the door as quietly as her aching body allowed. Each step woke fresh protests in her side and thighs, but she kept going, one hand against the wall for balance. When she reached the heavy wooden door she paused and pressed her ear to it. The outside room was larger. She could tell from the way sound traveled. Open, timbered, with hard surfaces and hanging cookware. The chopping had stopped. Liquid simmered somewhere with a thick, contented bubbling sound. A drawer slid open then shut. The voice resumed its humming, closer now. Male, she guessed. Unhurried. She tested the handle. Unlocked. That unsettled her more than a sealed door would have. Either her captor was arrogant enough to leave a recovered soldier unconfined, or confident enough not to care. The Lyra eased the door inward by a finger's width and looked through. At first the scene beyond refused to fit together. A long table made from a single slab of dark wood. Shelves lined with glass jars filled with seeds, powders, dried leaves, preserved roots. A cast iron stove radiating heat. Copper pans hanging in careful rows. Large windows beyond the main room looking out over a world drowned in white snow and dark evergreen forest beneath a sky turning violet with evening. And in the middle of that impossible domestic calm stood the most dangerous being she had ever seen outside a war report. A human. The file images had never prepared her for the scale of the shock. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, heavy in the way of something built by gravity rather than biotechnology. Dark hair untidy. Strong hands. A sweater of thick knitted material rolled to the forearms. An apron tied around his waist. He stood at a butcher block counter with a chef's knife in one hand, reducing a mound of orange and white vegetables into perfectly even cubes with clean economical strokes. No guards. No armor. No visible fear. Humanity had been a story in Solaran military education, a quarantined death world civilization too violent, too unstable, too fundamentally dangerous to integrate into standard galactic diplomacy. The stories differed by sector and instructor, but the essential shape never changed. Humans were the species you did not provoke unless you wanted entire systems turned into cautionary debris fields. They were apex predators from a world whose weather tried to kill them before breakfast and whose evolutionary solution to danger was usually some variation of hit it harder. Yet the creature in front of her was humming while cooking. Thalira's fingers tightened around the edge of the door until the fresh bandage at her ribs pulled painfully. The human set down the knife, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and without turning around said in calm accented trade standard, "If you try to stand there any longer, Commander, your stitches are going to start bleeding again." Every muscle in her body went rigid. He still hadn't turned. "You understand me," she said before she could stop herself. "Enough of it," he replied. "Enough to know frostbite patients should still be in bed." Slowly, deliberately, he turned to face her. He was younger than the reports had made humanity feel and older than she had expected one to look. Not old in a fragile sense. Weathered around the eyes. A scar angled white across one side of his jaw and vanished beneath the collar of the sweater. His gaze landed on her, then flicked once to her posture, bare feet, one hand bracing against the frame. Assessing. Instantly. Completely. Not a civilian look. He looked exactly once at the pain she was trying to hide and then back to her face. Good, she thought with a flash of stubborn pride. Let him work for the rest. "Who are you?" she demanded. The human picked up a wooden spoon and stirred whatever was simmering on the stove before answering, as if names could wait until after heat management. "Jonathan Hayes," he said. "You crashed in my lower field 3 nights ago." 3 nights. The words hit her harder than any blow had. She had been unconscious for 3 days. Her mind ran through the implications at once. Lost contact. Presumed dead. Command vacuum. Enemy movement unreported. Strategic codes compromised if implants had been stripped. Fleet survivors scattered if any remained. 3 days was long enough for wars to bend. She forced the panic down. "My armor," she said. "My implants. My command seals." "Armor's in pieces," he said. "Had to cut most of it off. It was fused half to the pod and half to you." He gave her another look, one that landed somewhere between clinical and faintly annoyed. "Your implants are still where nature and military overengineering put them. I'm not in the habit of digging around people's nervous systems before breakfast." He said it dryly, flatly, as if he was already tired of a conversation they had only just begun. Thalira opened the door wider and stepped into the room fully, refusing to give ground back to the bed behind her. "Why save me?" At that, for the first time, he looked genuinely puzzled. "Because you were dying," Jonathan said. The answer was so immediate, so unperformed, that it stalled every prepared suspicion she had loaded into the question. He turned back to the stove and lifted the lid from a heavy pot. Steam rolled upward, carrying with it a wave of scent so rich and savory that it punched through pain, fear, and military protocol and went straight to some primitive starving place in her body. Meat, onion, root vegetables, herbs, pepper, fat. Her stomach betrayed her with a low, humiliating sound. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, the way a man did when reality confirmed something he had already known and was trying very hard not to be smug about. "Right," he said. "Excellent. That settles the argument." "There is no argument. There is always an argument with half-frozen soldiers," he said. "Usually between common sense and dignity. Common sense tends to win once the food hits the table." He set 2 bowls on the counter and began ladling the stew into them with practiced precision. Thalira stood motionless in the center of the room, watching a mythological death world predator prepare dinner as snow fell peacefully outside the windows. Nothing in 20 years of war had prepared her for the possibility that the most terrifying species in the quarantine sectors might greet the dying with firelight, blankets, and something that smelled like garlic. Thalira's training returned all at once, as if the sight of the human had reached into her spine and found the part of her that had not yet agreed she was off the battlefield. She moved without thinking about it. 1 step toward the hearth. A bend at the waist that pulled fire through her ribs. Her fingers closing around the iron poker propped beside the stone. It was too heavy at the tip, too long for close work, and balanced like a piece of farm equipment rather than a proper weapon, but it was metal, solid, and presently in her hand. That was enough. Jonathan looked up from the stew, took in the poker, and sighed through his nose with the weary patience of a man who had predicted this exact moment hours ago. "I was hoping we could do this after you ate," he said. Thalira raised the iron bar into a guard position. Her arms trembled slightly from weakness, which infuriated her more than the pain. "Step away from the stove." "Why?" "Because I am armed." "Commander," he said calmly, "you are barefoot, concussed, partially stitched together, and holding a fireplace tool like you intend to win a border war against furniture." Armed is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The insult was so dry, so casually placed, that for half a second she did not know whether to be more offended by the words or by the fact that some traitorous part of her brain recognized the precision of them. You understand the reputation of your species? She asked, tightening her grip. You expect me to believe I am safe here? Jonathan set the ladle down. When he straightened fully, the room seemed to change around him, not because he had moved aggressively, but because stillness gathered around him in a way it did around predators and veterans and certain officers who had spent too long in command to waste energy proving it. He did not reach for the knife, did not crowd her, did not flinch at the poker pointed roughly in his direction. Safe enough, he said. Safer than vacuum. Safer than the crater. Safer than whatever was chasing you hard enough to knock a military pod out of the sky over my valley. His blue eyes flicked once to her stance, then to the bandage at her side. If you swing that, he added, you're going to tear the intercostal repair on the left side, reopen at least one stitch line, and probably pass out halfway through the follow-through. Which means I'll have to carry you back to bed after you hit me with an object designed for moving logs. The Lyra hated that he was probably right. She hated even more that he said it without menace. Pure assessment. Medical. Practical. Who else is here? She asked. No one. Lies. He shrugged. Believe what you like. It's still just me. Outside, wind moved softly against the glass. Snow hissed against one of the far windows in a brief white flurry. Somewhere beyond the room, deeper into the house or perhaps beneath it, she could hear the faint mechanical thrum of a generator cycling load. Not primitive then. Not simply a cabin in the wilderness. The books, the metal bracing in the beams, the hidden medical competence, the generator, the human himself. Nothing in this place aligned neatly with the image of a harmless frontier homestead. Her eyes narrowed. You are military. That drew the smallest smile from him. Not warm. Not mocking. More like acknowledgement between two people who had both spotted the same truth from opposite ends of the room. Not currently, Jonathan said. Currently I'm making stew while an alien officer points fireplace equipment at me. You knew exactly where my wounds were. I put them back together. You knew my rank. He nodded toward the remnants of a black patch lying folded near the basin on the sideboard. She had not noticed it before. Her insignia tab. Burned at one edge, scraped nearly blank, but enough of the command braid remained for a trained eye. You talk in orders, he said. You scan corners before asking questions. You led with logistics, then custody, then survival. Didn't take much detective work. He turned back to the counter, which should not have been possible. No sane being turned their back on an armed enemy. Yet he did it with such complete lack of performance that it rattled her more than if he had disarmed her outright. He tore a loaf of dark bread in half with his hands and set thick slices beside the bowls. Sit down. That was not a request I am obeying. No, he said. That was a medical instruction disguised as hospitality. She held her ground. He slid one bowl across the table anyway. Steam curled from the surface, carrying with it the scent of seared meat, softened onion, root vegetables, and something deeper beneath it. Stock simmered long enough to thicken into richness. Her empty stomach clenched so hard it was almost pain. She had survived on emergency nutrient gel and whatever remained in the broken pod's reserve lines before unconsciousness took her. Before that, the last thing she had consumed was bridge coffee and 2 protein tablets 12 minutes before Oak Haven collapsed into plasma fire. Jonathan picked up his own spoon and sat at the far side of the table, pointedly leaving distance between them. He took a bite, chewed, swallowed, then looked at her over the bowl. If I wanted you drugged, he said, I had 3 days and complete access to your bloodstream. If I wanted you dead, I could have left you where you landed. If I wanted information, there are easier ways to get it than feeding you. So for the moment, Commander, your choices are simple. Hit me with the poker and black out. Or put it down and eat before your body starts consuming what's left of your muscle tissue to keep your organs warm. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. The stew steamed. The human watched her with the maddening patience of someone certain time was on his side. The stories said humans were blood-hungry expansionists. That they solved fear with violence and inconvenience with domination. That quarantine had been the galaxy's only answer to a species too savage to civilize. But no one in those stories had ever mentioned this. The unnerving confidence of a human who had nothing to prove, the infuriating practicality, the way he spoke to a threatened enemy as if he were dealing with weather, injury, and a bad temper in that order. Her arms began to shake in earnest now. Jonathan noticed. Of course he noticed. He did not comment. That mercy absurdly did more than anything else to break the standoff. Slowly, furious at herself for every inch of it, the Lyra lowered the poker. The tip touched the floorboards first with a dull iron knock. Then she leaned it back against the stone. Jonathan gave one short nod, as if some internal prediction model had just resolved correctly. There, he said. That's better. It changes nothing. Usually doesn't, he agreed. Still means you should sit down. The Lyra crossed to the table on aching legs and lowered herself into the chair opposite him with as much command dignity as a half-frozen, bandaged officer in borrowed fabric could manage. The bowl in front of her radiated heat into her hands even before she touched it. She picked up the spoon, paused, then looked up sharply. If this is poisoned. Jonathan took another bite of his own stew. Then I've made dinner significantly more complicated than it needed to be. It was such a ridiculous answer that she almost laughed. Almost. Instead she tasted the stew. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Flavor hit her like a system shock. Salt. Fat. Heat. Soft potato breaking apart under the tongue. Meat so tender it barely needed chewing. Pepper warming the back of her throat. Garlic and herbs opening one after the other in layers so complex that for a horrifying instant she understood how a species might become dangerous simply by refusing to live on military rations. She took another bite before dignity could intervene. Then another. When she finally looked up, Jonathan was watching her with infuriating calm. Acceptable? He asked. The Lyra set the spoon down with deliberate precision. Yes, she said, because anything more honest would have been strategically disastrous. The human's mouth twitched once at one corner. Not a full smile. Worse. The smile of a man who knew exactly what victory looked like and had no need to announce it. The next 4 days unsettled Commander the Lyra Voss more deeply than the battle at Oak Haven. Battles made sense. Even bad ones. Especially bad ones. There were lines, losses, trajectories, causes. Ships died because someone failed a calculation or won one. Worlds burned because governments mistook appetite for policy. People survived because they moved quickly enough, hit hard enough, or were loved by probability for one more hour than they deserved. But nothing in Thalira's long military life had prepared her for the strategic instability of being cared for. Jonathan Hayes did not interrogate her. He did not ask for fleet dispositions, command encryption, assembly routes, or supply doctrine. He did not even press when the nightmares took her in the deep hours before dawn and she came awake in a tangle of blankets, one hand reaching for a sidearm that still was not there, pulse pounding so hard both hearts hurt. The first night it happened, she woke halfway to her feet, breath sharp, vision burning with the afterimage of the Resolute breaking apart around her. Jonathan's voice came from the doorway. Easy. Just that. Not soft. Not commanding. Not pitying. He stood there in low firelight holding a ceramic mug that steamed in the darkness. You're here, he said. No hull breach. No vacuum. Drink this before you try pretending you weren't about to collapse. He handed her the mug and left before she could decide whether to refuse. The liquid inside was bitter, dark, and carried a faint medicinal sharpness beneath the stronger taste of herbs. What is it? She had asked the next morning. Something between tea and field medicine, he replied, not looking up from the pan he was repairing at the kitchen table. Good for shock. Bad for optimism. She had stared at him. He had gone on tightening the rivets without explanation. That became the rhythm of the days. He gave little. Observed everything. Explained only when necessary and never one word more than his patience could tolerate. She learned the shape of the house in fragments. The main room opened into a narrow corridor, then a workshop so dense with tools and spare parts that it looked less assembled than accumulated through years of practical stubbornness. Beyond that sat a hydroponic chamber built partly into the rock beneath the house, lit by full-spectrum lamps and warm enough to make her skin prickle after the frozen air outside. He grew rows of leafy green plants, root vegetables, dense vine fruits, medicinal herbs, and grain hybrids in waist-high beds fed by a recirculating water lattice he had designed himself. You made all this? She had asked on the second day, still weak enough to lean one hand against the support frame while looking over the greenhouse. Jonathan, knee-deep beneath a filtration unit with a wrench between his teeth, slid out from under the machinery and spat the wrench into his hand. Mostly. This world is frontier ice. It's frontier ice on the surface, he said. Underneath, the soil composition's ugly but usable if you stop trying to make it behave like Earth and start asking what it actually wants to do. That answer lingered in her mind. Not because of the farming. Because it was how commanders spoke about difficult sectors, broken alliances, wounded soldiers, collapsing fronts. Stop demanding old behavior. Study reality. Work with what remains. He caught her studying him then, and one eyebrow lifted. What? You do not speak like a botanist. I contain multitudes, he said dryly, and went back to the filtration unit. She found herself almost smiling before she remembered that smiling at humans, especially unclassified ones, especially those belonging to a quarantine predator civilization, was not standard Solaran operational behavior. By the third day she could walk without the room tilting. By the fourth she could cross the house unassisted, though Jonathan still watched her when he thought she was not looking, tracking the set of her shoulders, the shortening in her breath when the left side pulled, the fraction of imbalance still present in her stride. He was infuriatingly good at it. He also cooked every meal as if nutrition alone were an insult and food ought to accomplish something more ambitious. Stews thick with meat and root stock. Flatbread brushed with oil and herbs. Eggs with black pepper and some fermented paste that made her eyes water and kept her going for hours. Dark coffee, his word, not hers, so bitter the first cup had convinced her he was attempting delayed revenge for the fireplace poker incident. People drink this willingly? She had asked, lowering the mug with an expression she did not bother to disguise. Jonathan had taken a long swallow from his own cup and nodded. By the billions. Why? Because despair tastes better with caffeine. She had looked from the mug to his perfectly serious face and then, against judgment and upbringing alike, laughed once. A short involuntary sound. Gone almost before it arrived. Jonathan blinked. Then, to her eternal annoyance, looked pleased with himself for the rest of the morning. It was not simply kindness that destabilized her understanding of him. It was competence in too many unrelated categories. He repaired cracked support braces with the calm efficiency of an engineer. Set bones and changed bandages like field medical personnel. Cooked like a quartermaster who had decided morale mattered. Read old physical books at night with the concentration of a scholar. Moved through the tree line outside with the effortless awareness of a predator born under gravity and weather. And sometimes when he forgot she was watching, something colder showed through. Once, while recalibrating a perimeter sensor half buried under the snow east of the house, she saw it happen. A faint triple chirp had sounded from the receiver in his coat pocket. Jonathan stopped mid-step, every line of him going still. Not frozen, focused. His eyes lifted to the dark tree line with such immediate lethal precision that the Lyra felt the air around them sharpen. What is it? She asked. Nothing, he said after 3 seconds. But he had drawn the sidearm at his lower back before answering, checked the line of the ridge, then only holstered it when the chirp did not repeat. That was not civilian reflex. That was survival worn into muscle memory through repetition. Later that evening, while he salted meat strips over the stove, she asked the question directly. You were military. The knife in his hand paused a fraction over the cutting board. Then resumed. Yes. She waited. He gave her nothing else. What branch? Earth branch. That is not an answer. It is the answer you're getting. She leaned back in the chair, studying him through the kitchen firelight. You hide a great many things for a man who claims to live alone with vegetables. Jonathan set the knife down and faced her fully. The expression on his face was not hostile. It was worse. Measured. I saved you, he said. Fed you. Patched your ribs. Did not ask for your codes, your fleet routes, or the details of whatever war followed you here. I'm extending you the same courtesy. The rebuke landed cleanly because it was deserved. The Lyra folded her hands in her lap to stop herself from reacting like a subordinate caught speaking out of turn. After a moment, she inclined her head once. A commander's acknowledgement, small but real. Jonathan accepted it with one nod and turned back to the stove. The silence after that should have been uncomfortable. It was not. That disturbed her too. On the 5th evening, snow came hard and thick, hissing against the glass until the forest beyond the windows disappeared into white static. The generator lights dipped once as the storm pressure shifted. Jonathan went down beneath the house to check the backup relay, and the Lyra remained in the main room with a blanket around her shoulders and one of his old books open on her knees. It was a history text. Printed. Annotated by hand in the margins. Not war history. Agricultural history. She had chosen it only because she wanted to understand what kind of species wrote lovingly detailed chapters about soil chemistry and irrigation revolutions and treated the prevention of famine with the same reverence military cultures reserved for decisive victories. One name appeared again and again in Jonathan's notes, underlined twice in blunt black ink. Norman Borlaug. When he returned, carrying cold air and machine grease with him, she lifted the book slightly. This one, she said. You marked him repeatedly. Jonathan hung his coat by the door and came over to glance at the page. Yeah. He was important. He saved a lot of people. He was a general? Jonathan looked at her then. Not mocking. Not surprised. Simply taking measure of the question. No, he said. He grew better wheat. The Lyra frowned. That is why you marked him? That is exactly why I marked him. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside the storm deepened. And for the first time since waking in the human's house, Commander the Lyra Voss felt the edges of a truth she had not wanted to consider. Perhaps the galaxy had not misunderstood humanity merely by fearing its violence. Perhaps it had misunderstood humanity by failing to understand what humans considered worth protecting in the first place. The illusion of peace ended at 11:43 local valley time with a sound the Lyra had not heard since the day Oak Haven burned. It began too low for human hearing. She knew that because Jonathan did not react at first. He was at the kitchen counter with one hand braced against a loaf of dark bread, slicing it into thick uneven pieces while something rich and red simmered in the pot behind him. Snowmelt tapped softly against the outer windows. The generator hummed beneath the floor. The house had settled into that strange twilight calm she had started, against all military judgment, to recognize as safety. Then the glass in the nearest window trembled. Only once. A barely visible ripple passed through the surface of the pane, so slight it could have been a trick of reflected firelight. But the water in the ceramic pitcher beside Thalira's elbow answered with a series of tiny concentric rings. Her spine locked. Jonathan looked up immediately. What? He asked. Thalira was already on her feet, every lesson from every campaign snapping into place with such speed that the room seemed suddenly too slow around her. Atmospheric compression, she said. High-velocity descent. Multiple contacts. The second vibration came harder. The copper pans hanging above the stove gave a faint metallic rattle. Somewhere in the house, a hidden sensor tripped and a sharp double tone chirped from behind the stone wall to the right of the hearth. Jonathan dropped the bread knife without a word and crossed the room in 3 fast steps. He pressed his palm flat against a section of fitted rock the Lyra had long suspected concealed something more complicated than insulation. A panel hissed apart, revealing a bank of recessed displays, hard controls, and 3 narrow tactical screens already filling with red descent vectors. The room changed. Not physically. Functionally. In one breath the warm house vanished, and what remained was a command node hidden inside it. The Lyra moved to his side before he could tell her not to. The telemetry resolved across the screens in ugly, stuttering arcs. 3 ships. No. 4. Low-orbit insertion running hot. Drive signatures erratic, aggressive, and deeply familiar. Her blood went cold in a way the winter outside had never quite managed. Kryn, she said. Jonathan's eyes never left the screen. You sure? I would know those drives in a coma. Her voice had dropped into command register before she noticed it. Hunter-killer configuration. Fast descent, no transmission, no diplomacy window. They tracked my escape pod. One of the red icons split into a cluster of smaller points. The Lyra leaned closer. Did the count once? Twice? Payload deployment confirmed, she said. Drone carriers. At least 40 to a ship. Jonathan swore once under his breath. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Like a man adjusting an old wound in his mind to fit a new and inconvenient fact. They found you 3 systems past a fleet detonation, he said. The Kryn do not stop once they mark command prey. Wonderful. Another screen came alive with an exterior thermal overlay of the valley. Snow-white terrain. Dark pines. The roofline of the house in clean blue geometric lines. Far above, 4 blazing objects cut downward through the cloud deck. The Lyra turned from the displays. We leave. Now. Jonathan hit a row of switches. Hidden systems woke beneath the floor and inside the walls with a rising electrical thrum. No. She stared at him. No. No, he repeated, already moving through a startup sequence with frightening efficiency. We're too late for clean evacuation and they're already tracking this site. If we run now, we give them our backs in open snow. You do not understand the Kryn. They do not raid for territory. They strip for biomass and command intelligence. They will level this valley. Jonathan glanced at her just once. Then back to the screen. They can certainly try. The calmness of it hit her harder than shouting would have. Outside the sky shifted. Not visibly all at once, but by degrees. The soft violet of incoming evening bruising toward a sickly purplish green as re-entry plasma smeared across the cloud base. The forest windows glowed with it. The whole valley looked suddenly like something being examined under hostile light. The alarm changed tone. Interior systems auto-unsealed. Power rerouted. Heat signatures masked. Perimeter grid online. The Lyra heard the changes before she understood them. Low hydraulic groans from beneath the ground east of the house. A heavy metallic clunk somewhere under the snowpack west of the tree line. The murmur of capacitor banks waking after long sleep. Jonathan stepped away from the wall console and went straight to a narrow cabinet built flush into the timber support by the back hall. The Lyra had assumed it held tools. It opened on biometric lock and folded outward into an armory. Weapons filled the recessed rack in tight pragmatic order. Long guns and black matte finish. Heavy sidearms. Compact carbines. Ammunition bricks stacked in coated columns. Med injectors. Spare comm rigs. 2 tactical vests already loaded. For the first time since meeting him, the Lyra lost the ability to conceal surprise. "You said you were a botanist." Jonathan pulled one of the vests free and shrugged into it. "I am." He reached past her for a compact pistol, checked the chamber with one smooth motion, then handed her a weapon longer and heavier than any civilian hunting piece had a right to be. "But before I got into soil chemistry," he said, "I did some other work." The gun in her hands was brutally human. No sleek ergonomic balance. No elegant plasma coil. Just weight, recoil promise, and a simple kinetic chamber built to survive mud, heat, and abuse. The Lyra checked it automatically. Magazine loaded. Mechanical safety. 8 heavy shells, tungsten core by the markings. Jonathan caught the movement and nodded once in approval. "Good," he said. "At least one of us won't shoot themselves learning the controls." "This is not a military outpost," she said, though the words sounded weak even to her now. The screens. The hidden systems. The armory. The comm. It had all been military from the start. She had simply mistaken quiet for absence. "No," Jonathan said, slamming another magazine into a rifle large enough to shame subtlety. "It's a house." Then he looked toward the western windows where the first of the descending Kryn ships became visible through the cloud breaks, black and insectal against the poisoned sky. His expression hardened into something she had only glimpsed in fragments before. "And they've made the mistake," he said, "of bringing a war to my front yard." The first impact did not hit the house. It hit somewhere out in the tree line to the north with a flat concussive thump that rolled through the valley floor and sent a tremor up through the boards beneath their boots. Snow fell in white curtains from the beams over the windows. The hanging copper pans rang softly against each other. One of the screens on the wall split its feed automatically, magnifying the northern ridge where a plume of dark earth and steam had erupted through the snowpack. "Probe strike," Jonathan said. "Testing for hidden structures." "You speak as if this happens often." "It happens often enough." That answer carried far more history than the 6 words could hold. The Lyra looked at him fully then, not the man with the stew pot, not the dry host with the herbal tonic and impossible patience, but the one standing in front of the open armory while hostile warships burned through the cloud deck above his home and his pulse had not risen by so much as a visible fraction. "Who are you?" she asked again. Jonathan tightened the strap on his tactical vest, then bent to unlock a lower rack hidden beneath the heavier rifles. What he drew out was not a weapon but a matte black case long enough to hold a disassembled precision system. He set it on the table, flipped the catches, and began assembling the contents with the unthinking speed of a man who had done it more times than memory bothered to number. "Jonathan Hayes," he said. "Still true. That is not the answer." "No," he agreed, fitting the upper receiver into place. "It's the one you get while the sky is filling with hostile contacts." The house shuddered again as another test strike hit the valley floor farther east. On the screen, one of the descending Kryn ships split open along its belly and vomited a glittering stream of smaller signatures into the air. Drones, their trajectories fanning wide as they dispersed into flanking patterns. Not clumsy. Not rushed. Efficient. Predatory. The Lyra's hands moved on instinct, pulling the action on the human weapon, checking shell seating, feeling the ugly reliability of it settle into her grip. 48 drones from that carrier. Maybe more if they double-stacked launch bays. They'll advance in crescent pressure and use the trees to narrow your fire lanes. Jonathan looked up sharply. "And the larger ships? They won't commit heavy bombardment until they know whether I am alive. If they suspect command intelligence survived Oak Haven, they will try to strip this location in layers. Drones first. Brood teams second. Orbital sterilization last." He gave a short nod. "Good. That matches what I've got." "You have records on the Kryn?" "I have records on anything stupid enough to approach the quarantine edge twice." The words landed harder than they should have. Quarantine edge. He said it the way a veteran said old forward line or artillery range. Not politically. Operationally. Another alarm sounded from deeper in the hidden console. Jonathan crossed back to the wall and touched a control strip. New screens lit up beneath the tactical displays, older-looking feeds, grainier, pulled from buried perimeter systems rather than the polished house network. They showed sectors of the valley the Lyra had not even realized were under surveillance. The lower creek bed, the frozen south pasture, the line of old stone markers half buried beyond the pines. "This place," she said slowly, "is not a farm." Jonathan glanced at her. "It is a farm." The generator load surged. Somewhere outside, something enormous unlocked beneath the snow with a hydraulic groan that seemed to come from the bones of the land itself. "It's also," he added, "a decommissioned watchpost, a hardened relay bunker, a fallback ordnance cache, and for the last 9 years my very quiet retirement plan." He pressed another switch. The western screen flashed white with static, then resolved into a thermal image of 2 cylindrical masses rising from concealed housings near the grain silos. Except they were not grain silos. Not really. Their tops peeled open in segmented steel petals, and from within each one emerged a twin-barreled turret housing on a reinforced magnetic collar, ugly and square and brutally physical. The Lyra stared. The Solaran Empire built its weapons like sculpture. Curved housings. Shield harmonic integration. Clean lines designed as much for morale and symbolism as for function. Human weapons, she was beginning to understand, were made by people who regarded beauty as an optional side effect of something surviving long enough to do its job. "Those are agricultural emplacements?" she asked dryly. Jonathan's mouth twitched once. "Multi-use infrastructure." She almost smiled despite herself, then did not, because one of the drone carriers on the screen had just angled lower and she could see its ventral armor plating irising apart as boarding organisms began to drop through the atmosphere in sealed cocoons. Jonathan followed her gaze. "Right," he said. "That's enough honesty for one evening." He reached above the armory and dragged down a hard case marked in faded white letters. UMC Frontier Response Kit Type 4. He tossed it onto the table, flipped it open, and started sorting contents with terrifying speed. Extra mags. Med patches. Explosive anchors. Thermal shrouds. A compact comm unit. A pair of filtered eye shields. A combat knife longer and heavier than Thalira's standard field blade. He looked up at her and for the first time since the alarms began, he spoke not like a host or a medic or a dry frontier eccentric, but like what he had always really been. "Listen carefully, Commander." His voice had changed. Not louder. Worse. Precisely stripped of everything unnecessary. "The first wave will try the perimeter and test the blind spots. If they decide this structure is hardened, they'll split and come through the greenhouse trench, the drainage culvert, and whatever they think is the weakest thermal seam. That means they'll attack where they think civilians would hide." He handed her a second magazine and a compact sidearm that fit better in her injured grip than the long gun. "So we don't hide there." The Lyra took the pistol automatically. "You've fought them before." "Not these specifically." "That is not what I asked." He met her eyes then. Whatever answer she expected, it was not the one he gave. "I've fought enough things in enough dark places," he said, "to know how monsters think when they smell an easy meal." Something cold moved down her spine. Not from fear of him. From recognition. She had known officers like this before. The ones who no longer described their experience in campaign names because there were too many, or because names belonged to historians and the thing itself belonged to whoever came back carrying it in silence. The nearest window flashed green. A lance of plasma slashed across the snowfield and impacted the old fence line south of the house. The wooden posts did not vaporize. A translucent dome shimmered into being half a meter above the ground, caught the bulk of the energy, then bled it away in a violent corona of blue-white light. Shields. Hidden in the land itself. Jonathan didn't even look up. They found the first layer. "You hid a defense lattice under your farm. I told you." Quiet retirement plan. This time her laugh came out before she could stop it. "Brief. Sure." Astonished. Jonathan gave her a sidelong look. "Good. Keep that. Shock gets people killed." A new tone pulsed through the room, 3 descending notes, repeated. Jonathan's expression hardened. "Contact on the north line," he said. "Drone groundfall." He snapped the precision rifle case shut and slung the assembled weapon across his back. Then he lifted the heavier rifle from the armory wall and checked the chamber with one hard metallic clack that seemed to reorganize the entire room around it. When he turned back to her, the last illusion disappeared. No farmer. No botanist. No quiet man making stew. Just Jonathan Hayes, whatever he had once been before the valley took his name and pretended it could soften the rest. "Welcome to the frontier, Commander," he said. Then he reached past her, hit the final arming switch, and outside in the darkening snow the valley woke up for war. The valley answered first with thunder. Not weather. Not artillery in the civilized sense. A deep ripping concussion that rolled through the snow and into Thalira's bones as the concealed turrets near the false grain silos came fully online and opened fire. The sound was monstrous. Human ballistics did not hiss or crackle or sing the way Solaran plasma arrays did. They tore. Each burst sounded like the sky itself was being fed through a steel grinder. Red tracer fire lanced through the darkening stormlight in hard flat lines, stitching the northern tree line with such obscene volume that entire curtains of snow detonated upward into white mist. On the west screen the first Kryn drones hit the ground running. They were larger than the standard hunter caste deployed at Oak Haven. 8 feet at the shoulder, 4-jointed limbs driving them low and fast through the pines, upper torsos armored in ridged black chitin with bio-integrated plasma throats pulsing sick green. Their movement triggered something primitive in the body, an old prey memory even trained soldiers rarely admitted to having. Too quick. Too many angles. Too silent between bursts. The leading rank reached the first fence line. The buried defense lattice flared again. 3 drones vanished in a wash of blue-white discharge and the survivors scattered at once, adapting with the speed that had made the Kryn such a horror along the frontier worlds. They did not rush mindlessly. They flowed. One group split for the creek bed. Another cut south toward the greenhouse trench. A third dropped flat into the tree shadows and began using the burning wreck of their own descent pods as staggered cover. "They're reading the grid fast," the Lyra said. Jonathan was already moving. He hit a switch by the rear window. A section of the wall folded inward, revealing a firing embrasure disguised inside the timber bracing. Freezing air and the stink of scorched resin rushed into the room. He planted one boot against the interior brace, shouldered the rifle, and fired 3 times in deliberate succession. Boom, boom, boom. The Lyra watched through the thermal feed as 3 separate Kryn signatures broke apart in the snow, center mass pulped by rounds with enough kinetic authority to make armor seem like a philosophical preference rather than a protection. "No warning shots?" she asked. Jonathan did not look away from the sight line. "You seeing any on their side?" She moved to the eastern embrasure and brought the human long gun up awkwardly, still adjusting to its ugly weight and brutal stock geometry. The drainage culvert glowed on the thermal overlay, a dark scar running under the southern rise. 2 drones were using it exactly as Jonathan predicted, staying low, letting the frozen stone absorb their heat signature between movement bursts. One of them looked up, its multifaceted head fixed on the house. The Lyra fired. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a kicked door and nearly tore the healing rib line open, but the shell hit true. The front half of the drone's skull ceased to exist in a red-black spray that painted the culvert wall and steamed against the snow. The second drone launched forward instantly, no hesitation, using the dead one's body as a stepping platform. Jonathan's sidearm barked from across the room, one flat metallic crack compared to the deeper roar of the long guns, and the creature cartwheeled mid-leap, lower limbs shredded out from under it. "Lead your targets less," he said. "I killed mine. You also nearly shot through the support line under the kitchen." The Lyra worked the action, ejected the smoking shell, and ignored him with the dignity such slander deserved. "Then perhaps your kitchen should not occupy my firing sector." Something struck the outer shield hard enough to light the whole room green. A heavy plasma bolt. Then another. Then a coordinated volley from the surviving descent ships above the cloud line. The house groaned. Dust sifted from the beams. The mugs on the shelf rattled. One of the copper pans tore free of its hook and hit the floor with a metallic crash. "Orbital ships are getting impatient," Jonathan muttered. "They'll keep probing until they identify the power source. Then we make them regret getting that far." The north camera feed died in a burst of static. Then the west. Then a buried sensor under the orchard line cut out one by one in 3 quick pulses. Not malfunction. Advance. "Close contact," the Lyra said. Jonathan reached under the console and slapped a second control bar. Outside, hidden floodlights burst on across the lower field, blasting the valley in hard white illumination. The effect was immediate. Dozens of Kryn forms were suddenly visible, not the few scattered signatures the thermal overlays had implied, but an entire second wave pressed flat into the folds of the land, using snow berms, fallen logs, and shell craters to close the distance. They hated open light, but they hated being seen more. Jonathan swore once quietly. "Clever bugs." The first brood cannon answered from the darkness. Not shipborne. Grounded. A heavy green beam speared through the floodlight mast on the south slope, vaporizing steel and showering the field with incandescent fragments. Another hit the outer barn wall and blew it inward in a storm of timber and frozen mud. Thalira's blood ran cold. Broodmaster. Where? She was already on the screen, fingers dancing over the target overlays as if the console were Solaran instead of human. South Ridge. Buried approach. It used the old route line to shield its signature. Jonathan shifted beside her. Can you mark it? She did better than that. The Broodmaster fired again, its shot slicing across the greenhouse trench, and for a fraction of a second the recoil bloom exposed the shape behind the ridge. A colossal armored mass crouched low, cannon throat glowing, directing the wave like a living siege engine. There. Jonathan did not waste a second admiring the spot. He swung the rifle to the southern embrasure and unleashed a 3-round burst so violent the muzzle flare lit half the room. 1 round hit rock. 1 clipped chitin. The third found some vulnerable seam and detonated in a flash of black fluid and shattered armor. The Broodmaster screamed. The sound was so vast and metallic and enraged that even the surviving drones faltered. The Lyra did not let them recover. Now, she shouted, though Jonathan was already moving. He hammered the south trigger bank. The silo turrets pivoted as one. A wall of tungsten and tracer fire tore across the ridge and simply erased the place where the Broodmaster had been. For 2 beautiful seconds the valley belonged to them. Then the east wall exploded inward. A Kryn drone had gotten through the greenhouse trench under the shield harmonics and slammed bodily through the timber and steel, bringing smoke, splinters and freezing air with it. It hit the floor in a spray of broken boards and came up firing from the chest. Jonathan moved faster than the Lyra thought anything human-sized should. He shoved her sideways behind the kitchen table as the plasma burst scorched across the room, turning shelves of jars into bursting comets of glass and dried herbs. The heat washed over them like a furnace door opening. He was already up on one knee, sidearm barking twice into the smoke. The first shot took the drone low. The second hit its sensory cluster. It kept coming. The Lyra grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth, the same ridiculous weapon that had started all this, and drove forward on instinct born far older than doctrine. The point of the iron bar punched into the split seam Jonathan's rounds had opened at the base of the creature's throat. She put her full weight behind it and felt something internal rupture wetly. The drone convulsed. Its cannon spat 1 blind final bolt into the ceiling. Then it crashed sideways into the stove with enough force to crack stone and scatter burning wood across the floor. For a moment neither of them moved. Smoke rolled through the room. A curtain near the east wall caught fire and climbed fast. The smell of scorched chitin mixed with iron, soup stock, hot metal and burning pine. Jonathan coughed once, looked at the dead drone half sprawled across his broken kitchen, then at the Lyra still gripping the poker in both hands. Well, he said hoarsely, that answers whether you can use the fireplace equipment. She was breathing too hard to answer. Outside, the gunfire was thinning, not because the battle was won but because the first wave was dead enough to stop testing the perimeter. The tactical screen showed retreating signatures at the tree line, regrouping beyond the floodlit kill zone. The descent ships above had climbed back into cloud shadow. They're pulling off, the Lyra said. Temporarily. She looked at the smoking hole in the east wall, then at the spreading fire along the curtains and shelving. Jonathan followed her gaze. Yeah, he said. House is compromised. On the southern screen a new contact bloomed, far larger than the first carriers, still in upper atmosphere, descending slow and deliberate with the mass signature of something that had not come for probing or retrieval. It had come to finish. The Lyra felt both hearts tighten. Jonathan saw it at the same moment and all the grim dry humor left his face. That, he said, means we're done playing Homestead. He crossed to the back corridor, hit a concealed release under the armory rack, and a section of concrete floor began to split open beneath the smoke and falling ash. Grab ammo, he said. And don't leave the med patches. The house that had sheltered her, fed her, and confused every certainty she possessed was burning around them now. And somewhere below it, deeper than any farm had a right to go, something far more dangerous was waiting to wake. The floor split with a heavy hydraulic groan, folding back in 2 concrete jaws to reveal a steel lift cage descending into blackness. Heat from the burning house rolled across the opening in violent waves. Smoke gathered under the rafters. Somewhere above them, another plasma strike hit the outer shield and turned half the western windows into white sheets of cracking brilliance. The whole structure shuddered. One of the overhead beams gave a long tortured creak that sounded far too much like the beginning of the end. Jonathan had already crossed to the supply rack. He moved through the smoke with fast economical precision, not wasting so much as a glance on the ruined kitchen. Magazine bricks, med patches, a compact case of tools, a sealed tube of injectors. He shoved all of it into a hard-sided field pack and thrust a second bag toward the Lyra. Ammo first, he said. Then the med kit. Then anything you absolutely can't live without in the next 6 hours. The Lyra took the bag and stared at him through drifting smoke. You say that as though you expect the next 6 hours to be unusually eventful. Jonathan snatched a palm-sized drive from the wall console and pocketed it. Commander, we're leaving a burning fortified house through a hole in the floor while an alien strike element calls in something large enough to make their first wave look polite. I'm expecting the next 6 hours to be memorable. Despite the heat and the chaos and the fact that the east wall of the room no longer existed in any useful sense, something almost like amusement flickered through her. She obeyed. 2 loaded shell belts. A spare sidearm magazine. Field dressings. A compact thermal wrap. A narrow case marked with human medical symbols she did not recognize but trusted more than she wanted to admit. The house groaned again. Jonathan hit a kill switch by the rear wall. The tactical displays blanked one by one, leaving only the exterior feeds running on autonomous defense loop. That's it. The Lyra asked. That's enough. He slung the field pack over one shoulder and nodded toward the opening. Move. They dropped into the lift cage just as part of the upper corridor collapsed behind them in a storm of sparks and burning timber. Jonathan slammed his palm against the descent plate. The cage doors snapped shut in front of them, thick steel internal lock bars, no decorative concessions at all, and the lift lurched violently downward. Above them the house continued to die. The noise came muffled now through meters of reinforced concrete and stone. Distant concussions. A grinding crash. The warped scream of stressed metal. Each sound arrived dimmer than the last as the lift plunged deeper, carrying them through layers of old infrastructure hidden beneath the valley floor. The Lyra braced one hand against the rail as her ears popped. How deep? She asked. Deep enough. That is not a measurement. It's the one that matters. She should have found the answer irritating. Under other conditions she would have. But the truth was the descending lift had already given her a measurement far more troubling than words. 50 meters. 120. Still going. This was no improvised shelter. The walls beyond the cage were cut smooth and ribbed with military reinforcement bands. Power conduits thicker than her wrist disappeared into the dark at regular intervals. At one point they passed an old blast door with faded warning lettering stamped across it in human script and numeric hazard codes worn almost white with age. At another level a long gallery flashed by, lined with stacked fuel cells and drone casings under dustless tarps. Jonathan caught her looking. I told you, he said. Watch post. This is not a watch post, she said quietly. This is a buried war spine. He gave her a look that, in any other moment, might have been approval. The lift hit bottom with enough force to make the steel cage ring. The doors split open. The Lyra stepped out and forgot, for one full breath, that she was supposed to keep moving. The cavern beyond the lift was enormous. Not polished. Not ceremonial. Not built to impress. It was worse than impressive because every visible line of it had been shaped by purpose rather than vanity. A subterranean hangar carved straight into bedrock, supported by steel latticework and concrete ribs thick enough to anchor a mountain. Flood lamps blazed from overhead gantries, washing the chamber in stark white light. Maintenance cranes hung on rail tracks along the ceiling. Fuel lines the size of tree trunks disappeared into recessed bays. Whole sections of the floor were marked in hazard bands and old Earth military stencils. And at the center of it all, resting on a magnetic cradle like a spear laid across an altar, stood a ship. The Lyra had commanded battle cruisers. She had seen assembly dreadnoughts, Solaran carriers, Keth void arches and Vraxian cutter hives. This was none of those. The vessel was all hard angles and armored appetite. No sweeping lines. No aesthetic softness. It looked as though someone had taken the idea of a warship, removed every trace of elegance from it, and then given the result permission to survive any amount of incoming hatred. Matte black hull. Layered armor plating. Heavy ventral mass suggesting impossible internal reinforcement. Turret housings recessed along the spine. Broad rail apertures forward. Engine assemblies built like industrial verdicts. Faded white block letters still clung to one section of the hull. UV Blackthorn Strategic Response Corvette North American Yards. The Lyra felt her pulse hammer. This, she said slowly, was under your greenhouse. technically under the south orchard. Jonathan limped past her toward the forward boarding ramp. The greenhouse is one level above the munitions bay. She turned to him sharply. You said you were retired. I am retired. You said you were a botanist. He hit the access switch. The boarding ramp descended with a hydraulic hiss. I am a botanist. The floodlights threw sharp shadows across his face as he looked back at her, smoke still in his hair, soot across one cheek, tactical vest strapped over the same sweater he had been wearing while slicing bread an hour earlier. Commander, he said, human beings are allowed to be more than one thing. He started up the ramp. The Lyra followed, boots hammering against ribbed metal decking. The interior matched the exterior perfectly. Spartan corridors. Exposed conduit runs. Crash webbing. Manual overrides beside every automated system. No ornamental paneling. No soft indirect light. Every surface seemed designed to answer three questions in order. Does it work? Can it keep working under fire? And can someone fix it with a wrench while bleeding? Jonathan moved like a man returning not to an old secret, but to an old posture. He cut across the central gangway, into a cockpit armored deep inside the ship's core. It was tighter than a Solaran bridge by an order of magnitude and infinitely more brutal. Physical switches. Mechanical locks. Analog redundancies. The pilot's seat was built around restraint harnesses that implied acceleration profiles the Lyra would have classified as crew abuse in any respectable navy. Jonathan dropped into the command chair and began waking the ship with the intimacy of long practice. Power came alive in layers. First a low hum through the deck. Then warning strips. Then the main tactical glass unfolding across the forward arc in sheets of pale light. Then a deep bass vibration from somewhere far aft as the buried reactor accepted ignition and began to turn old stored mass into terrifying possibility. The Lyra strapped herself into the co-pilot station before he told her to. The system's bloom across her board was enough to make even a veteran officer go still. Shield architecture minimal. Armor index absurd. Propulsion signatures unreadably dense. Weapons classifications partially masked even on internal displays. Half the active systems had names she did not know and the other half were tagged in shorthand human abbreviations that felt more like jokes than ordnance categories. Outside, one of the external cameras caught the moment the house above them finally lost structural coherence and folded inward in a blossom of sparks and fire. Jonathan saw it too. His jaw tightened once. That was all. Sorry about the garden, the Lyra said quietly. He keyed in a launch authorization string that seemed far too long for any civilian vessel. I'm billing them for it. The tactical board pulsed red. A new contact had reached low orbit above the valley, larger than the descent ships, heavier than a brood carrier, radiating command signatures through the atmosphere like poison through water. The Lyra's eyes widened. That's not a recovery vessel. No. It's a local siege node. I know. It can glass the entire district. Jonathan's hands settled on the flight controls. Then we leave before it finishes deciding where to start. He looked over at her, blue eyes hard beneath the cockpit glow. You wanted to run earlier, Commander? Good news. He armed the launch cradle. The whole buried hangar woke around them in a storm of sirens and unlocking steel. We're done pretending this valley was the important part. The Blackthorn did not launch. It was fired. The magnetic cradle beneath the corvette discharged with a violence that turned the buried hangar into a cannon barrel. The Lyra was slammed back into her restraint harness so hard her vision whitened at the edges. Somewhere behind them, blast doors sealed in sequence. Somewhere above, the last of Jonathan's valley defenses detonated in timed collapse. Then the ship punched upward through the vertical launch shaft and tore out of the mountain in a shower of rock, fire, and buried snow. For one impossible second the Lyra saw the whole valley spread beneath them. The burning ruin of the house. The shattered greenhouse. The false grain silos still vomiting tracer fire into the dark. Kryn descent ships banking hard to reacquire a target that had just exploded out of the ground they were trying to claim. Then the Blackthorn rolled, engines howling, and the world became bruised sky and acceleration. Jonathan handled the ship the way he did everything else that mattered. Without flourish, without wasted movement, with the cold practical focus of a man who had long ago decided hesitation was a luxury for people whose homes were not on the frontier. Local siege node is locking us, the Lyra said, reading the tactical bloom as new red brackets crawled over the display. If that thing gets a clean firing solution. It won't. That confidence is becoming irritating. It's meant to be reassuring. It is failing. That almost drew a laugh out of him, but not quite. His hands moved across the controls, dropping the corvette low through the atmospheric layers in a series of violent vector changes that no Solaran flight computer would have permitted and no Solaran pilot would have survived with their dignity intact. The Blackthorn didn't try to outshine enemy targeting with sleek maneuver discipline. It simply stopped being where the fire was expected to land. The first plasma strike missed by 30 meters. The second clipped them. The Lyra braced for shield collapse. No shield bloom came. Instead, the external armor lit white-hot across the port side, flared, then shed the outer heat layer in a cascade of incandescent metal petals that spun away behind them and vanished into the clouds. She stared. Your hull just did what? Jonathan didn't look away from the flight path. Its job. The Blackthorn punched into slip space 2 seconds later. Reality tore open in front of them like dark cloth forced apart by a blade. The transition hit the Lyra like a fist through both hearts. Geometry folded. Light broke apart into impossible angles. Every instinct in her body screamed that movement through such space should be forbidden by physics, religion, or basic decency. Jonathan merely tightened the harness another notch and said, "Try not to bite your tongue." When they came out, the viewport filled with the sight of her world under siege. Brilliant. Capital world of the Solaran Empire. Home. Center of command. The place she had spent her life defending from distances she never expected to collapse all at once. It hung ahead of them in blue-white beauty, half-shrouded in golden cloud bands and ringed now by war. Kryn ships swarmed high orbit in layered assault formation. Strike craft poured around the defense grid like insects around wounded flesh. The outer shield lattice over the capital hemisphere was flickering visibly, each new impact turning sections of it from gold to white to transparent for terrifying fractions of a second. "They're here already?" she whispered. Jonathan's answer was quiet. They were moving the moment they took Oak Haven. The tactical board detonated into warning tones. Solaran defense batteries had picked them up. Friendly lock patterns cascaded over the Blackthorn's hull, sharp and panicked and utterly justified. On the command frequency, 3 overlapping voices demanded immediate identification and transponder validation. Jonathan glanced at her once. "Your people are about to make a bad choice." The Lyra was already at the comms. She ripped the encrypted command seal from the chain at her throat, slammed it into the reader, and opened the highest military channel still accepting priority authentication. "This is Commander the Lyra Voss of the 7th Vanguard," she said, forcing command steel into a voice still rough from cold and smoke. "Abort target lock immediately. I repeat, abort target lock. My biosignature is live. Do not fire on this vessel." Static. Then disbelief. Then a shaken operations officer whose voice she recognized from fleet logistics briefings 3 years earlier. "Commander Voss? You were confirmed lost over Oak Haven. Your confirmation was incorrect. Clear us a descent path to the Citadel now. I have contact-level intelligence and an allied strategic asset aboard." There was a dangerous pause at the far end of the line. Then, slowly, the targeting brackets vanished from the board. "Descent corridor opening," the officer said. "Ancestors preserve us, Commander. What are you flying?" The Lyra looked at the black armored reflection of the ship across her console glass. "A very old warning," she said and cut the channel. The Blackthorn landed on the upper military platform of the Citadel under full guard. Plasma lances tracked them the entire way down. By the time the ramp opened, 2 full companies of Palace defense troops had the corvette surrounded in concentric lines of white armor and humming energy weapons. Beyond them, Senate officials, command aides, and media drones clustered in a state just this side of mass panic. Jonathan stood at the top of the ramp beside her in smoke-stained frontier gear and looked down at the reception with the expression of a man mildly inconvenienced by weather. "Friendly place," he muttered. "Do not shoot anyone," the Lyra said. "Wasn't planning to unless they worked very hard at it." They descended together. The guards parted only when they recognized her face, and even then they did so reluctantly, their eyes sliding past her to Jonathan and then to the Blackthorn behind him with open fear. To them he was not a man yet. He was a category collapse wearing boots. Minister Kaler pushed through the line of officers in ceremonial robes so impractical the Lyra could feel her patience leaving the room at the sight of him. "Commander Voss," he said, breathless and pale. "You disappear with the fleet and return in an unregistered predator craft accompanied by the reason we are not already dead," the Lyra snapped. Kaler recoiled. "Good. The outer shield will fail within the hour," he said, trying to reclaim authority and failing. "Emergency terms of capitulation are already being drafted. We may yet save the core population if—" "No," the Lyra said, and the single word hit the landing deck like a blade dropped flat. "The Kryn do not accept surrender. They accept harvest. He opened his mouth to argue. Jonathan stepped past her. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Get me to your Senate chamber, he said, or explain to your grandchildren that you spent your last free hour negotiating table etiquette with the only person in this system who can still call in help. The line of guards wavered. Kaler stared at him. Then, because fear has always recognized the shape of real authority faster than politics does, he stepped aside. 10 minutes later, Jonathan Hayes stood in the center of the Solaran Senate floor. Above him, the great tactical dome projected the battle in murderous detail. Kryn carriers closing, strike clouds thickening, shield sectors failing one by one. Around him, hundreds of senators and military adjutants shouted over one another in controlled collapse. The Lyra took the central podium first and cut through the noise with rank, fury, and the last intact pieces of her authority. You are discussing surrender to an enemy that farms civilizations, she said. Stop. The room obeyed because they were frightened enough to remember discipline. Then she turned and gave the podium to Jonathan. The sight of him there, human, soot-marked, broad-shouldered, looking profoundly unimpressed by imperial architecture and collective panic alike, did more to silence the chamber than her rank had. Jonathan set a blocky black communications unit on the crystal podium. 3 centuries ago, he said, your assembly quarantined human space because you thought our species was too violent, too unstable, and too dangerous to be trusted outside its own borders. No one moved. You thought you were locking us away, he went on. What you actually gave us was time. He leaned forward, one hand resting on the podium as the tactical dome above them flashed with another shield collapse warning. Time to build. Time to mine. Time to harden. Time to remember exactly what kind of things come out of the dark when civilized powers start believing rules can replace readiness. A senator in gold command silk stood halfway from her seat. And what exactly are you claiming, human? Jonathan looked up at the orbital display. Then back at the chamber. That Earth never stopped preparing for the day your side of the galaxy needed something uglier than diplomacy. He keyed the comm unit live. This is Jonathan Hayes, Watchtower Aegis Frontier Line, transmitting on Black Protocol Authority. SEAL status compromised. Kryn fleet in active siege posture over Aurelian. Requesting immediate intervention under mutual survival contingency. Static flooded the chamber. Then a voice answered. Human. Professional. Watchtower signal confirmed. This is Fleet Command Vessel UN Resolute Dawn. We have your telemetry. Hold orbit for 3 minutes. Every Solaran in the room went still. The voice continued. And Commander Hayes? Jonathan's mouth hardened into the ghost of a smile. Yeah. Good to hear you're still alive. The line clicked dead. For one heartbeat nothing happened. Then the sky above Aurelian split open. The sky above Aurelian did not merely open. It ruptured. 1 slip-space tear would have been a strategic miracle. 2 would have been a fleet action. What appeared above the capital world was something else entirely. A coordinated fracture line stretched across high orbit from pole to pole, a chain of violent white wounds punched through reality with such scale and precision that the tactical dome struggled for 3 full seconds to render what it was seeing. Then the first human warship came through. It was enormous. Not elegant. Not ceremonial. Not built for the eye of diplomats or the comfort of peace. It emerged from the tear in spacetime like a fortress that had decided movement was optional until now and had suddenly changed its mind. Black armor. Layered hull plates. Rail apertures the size of transit corridors. Engine masses glowing a hard furnace blue behind armored vent baffles. Then came another. And another. And another. An entire line of Earth warships punched into Solaran orbit in disciplined silence. No hails, no posturing, no attempt to negotiate for better position. They arrived already arranged for annihilation. Heavy carriers shielded by brutal wedge destroyers. Missile cruisers sliding into overlapping lanes. Corvettes like the Blackthorn, smaller and faster, fanning outward in a screen of hard-moving knives. At the center of the formation came the flagship. UN Resolute Dawn. The name hit the Lyra like a blow because once, years ago, there had been a Solaran ship by that name, and because human beings either had no sense of irony at all or possessed too much of it to survive in a healthy state. The flagship dwarfed the Kryn command ships. It looked less like a vessel and more like a statement metallurgy had been forced to make under oath. The Senate chamber had gone utterly still. Above them, the tactical dome painted the Kryn reaction in violent streams of red. Their carriers broke bombardment pattern at once, trying to reorient. Strike clouds split. Dreadships pivoted broadside. Their commanders were doing exactly what trained officers should do when a new force entered the battlespace. It did not help them. The resolute Dawn fired first. The tactical overlay had no graceful visual for it. No flowing beam. No dramatic energy lance. Just 3 dense signatures accelerating so fast the predictive systems initially marked them as sensor error. Then the front rank of Kryn siege ships ceased to have fronts. Relativistic slugs punched through their thermal shields as if those shields were superstition painted over vacuum. One cruiser lost its bow and central spine in the same instant, splitting into 2 halves that continued drifting for a second before the internal atmosphere found fire and turned the carcass into a starburst of expanding metal. Another took the second slug through the drive section and vanished into nuclear bloom so bright the Senate dome dimmed itself automatically. A third ship did not explode at all. It simply came apart along stress lines no engineer would ever have wanted exposed, each section moving gently away from the others as if the vessel had changed its mind about being one object. Jonathan watched the display with his arms folded. "They always try to tank the first volley," he said. Kaler, standing 3 seats down from the Lyra with one hand gripping the rail as if the floor itself had become politically unreliable, turned to him in shock. "That was the first volley?" Jonathan nodded. "Warm-up shot." The battle became slaughter measured in mathematics. Kryn strike craft swarmed toward the human fleet and vanished into expanding fields of point defense fire so dense they looked almost solid. Solaran tacticians had always imagined combat as a contest of maneuver, shield modulation, and energy cycling. Human fleets treated it more like industrial subtraction. Space around them filled with tracer webs, missile blooms, fragmentation clouds, killbox overlays. Entire fighter wings simply failed to remain present long enough to complete attack runs. Where Kryn plasma hit human hulls, armor flashed white, shed mass and kept going. Where human kinetics hit Kryn hulls, the hulls ended. And beneath all of it, running through every comm band that bled into the Senate chamber, came the voices of human officers and pilots at work. No panic. No grand speeches. No rage. Just the calm brutal language of professionals dismantling a threat. Valkyrie flight, cut left, mark the carrier seam. Copy. 2 seconds. Driver battery ready. Send it. Point defense sector 9 saturated, roll us 20 degrees and let the bastards waste the angle. Boarding pods attempting underside approach. Not for long. The Lyra felt something rise in her chest that was not simply relief. Not triumph either. Recognition, perhaps. For the first time since Oak Haven she was watching a force meet the Kryn without confusion, without desperation, without that terrible late-stage hope that cleverness might persuade predators to become something other than what they were. The humans understood the enemy. More than that, they had expected them. They had built for them. The Kryn command carrier tried to withdraw. The resolute Dawn let it run for 17 seconds. Then a spread of guided penetrators reached it from 3 different vectors, bored through the aft armor, and turned its internal brood chambers into molten pressure. The giant vessel collapsed inward on itself like something ashamed to still be visible. Around the capital the siege broke. Not slowly. Not strategically. Psychologically. The surviving Kryn ships stopped fighting for victory and began fighting for escape. That was the moment the Lyra knew the battle was over. "Watch," Jonathan said quietly. He was not speaking to her alone. He was speaking to the room. The tactical dome shifted zoom, following one damaged Kryn heavy cruiser as it rolled away from the main engagement, drives flaring irregularly, trying to claw enough distance to make the jump corridor. A pack of smaller human corvettes fell into loose pursuit, not closing to kill range, not yet. Simply herding. Staying visible. Keeping pace while feeding telemetry back into every surviving enemy sensor. Witnesses, the Lyra realized. Exactly as they had done at Oak Haven. Exactly as Earth had done wherever it chose not merely to defeat something, but to make sure the story of the defeat traveled home intact. The last major Kryn formation broke 12 minutes later. The remaining ships scattered in every direction open to them, fleeing through debris and fire and the cooling remains of their own certainty. Human pursuit wings followed just far enough to ensure the retreat became memory rather than rumor. Then the sky over Aurelian cleared. For the first time in hours, the tactical dome showed stars instead of siege fire. The silence that fell in the chamber afterward was unlike the previous ones. Not panic. Not disbelief. Recalculation. An entire civilization of senators, ministers, officers, and career survivors staring up at a sky that had been moments from extinction and now contained, instead, a wall of black human warships holding the dark at bay. Jonathan picked up the comm unit from the podium and keyed one final channel. "Aurelian orbit secure," he said. "You can tell right he was late." The answer came at once, carrying the faint crackle of bridge noise behind it. Negative haze. We're precisely on schedule. That finally drew a short breath of laughter out of the Lyra. Jonathan glanced sideways at her, and this time there was no mistaking the humor in his eyes. Tired? Sure. Human. She stepped forward before the chamber could remember politics and laid her fist over the place where both her hearts beat under armor and scar and still healing flesh. The old warrior's salute. The one reserved for debt beyond repayment. Jonathan Hayes, she said, and her voice carried through the Senate chamber with perfect clarity. In the name of the Solaran people, I acknowledge a truth our galaxy feared too long to learn. Every eye in the room was on her. She did not look away from him. You were never the monsters beyond the wall, she said. You were the wall. No one spoke after that because nothing smaller than silence would have survived next to the shape of it. Jonathan shifted the comm unit under one arm, uncomfortable in a way he had not been while calling down fleets or fighting brood things in burning kitchens. We're not here to rule anybody, he said at last. His gaze moved from the Lyra to the chamber, to the dome above them, to the stars where human warships drifted in calm murderous patience. We built all this, he said, because sooner or later something always comes out of the dark believing kindness means weakness and distance means safety. We learned a long time ago not to count on being lucky when that day arrives. He nodded once toward the stars. So no, he finished. We didn't come to conquer the galaxy. We came to make sure there's still one left after the monsters have had their turn. Hours later, long after the emergency crews had begun triage and the Senate had started the painful administrative work of admitting it had nearly signed its own species into a slaughter pit, the Lyra stood on the upper observation platform beside the Blackthorn. Aurelian's sky had returned to its natural blue-black. The stars were moving again. Human ships held orbit in patient lines above the capital, dark and immense and utterly unashamed of what they were. Jonathan stood beside her in silence, hands in his jacket pockets, looking not at the warships but at the horizon where dawn was beginning to gather. The quarantine is over now, the Lyra said. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Yeah. That changes everything. It usually does. She turned to him. Will your people stay? He considered the question with that same practical stillness he brought to everything. Long enough, he said. To help you rebuild. To make sure the Kryn understand the route here is closed. To get your politicians used to the idea that peace sometimes requires ugly machinery. The Lyra almost smiled. You speak as if that will be difficult. Jonathan's mouth twitched. Commander, I've met politicians on 3 worlds now. I'm becoming a universal expert. Below them the city lived. Sirens faded. Traffic resumed. Emergency craft crossed the lower sky in ordered lanes. People who would have died by the billions if the day had gone differently were, at this very moment, doing ordinary things with no idea how narrowly the ordinary had survived. The Lyra looked out over all of it and thought of the cabin in the snow, of roasted garlic and firelight and a human humming while chopping vegetables, of a man who grew impossible things in hostile soil and kept a warship beneath his orchard because the frontier was where peace had to be defended before it could be enjoyed. The galaxy had feared humanity's violence. That had been the easy part to fear. The harder truth, the one that would change history once it finished traveling through every frightened government and every surviving Kryn report, was simpler. Humanity had not built its terrible strength because it loved war. It had built it because when the darkness finally came, somebody had to be ready to stand in the doorway and say, no farther. The Lyra placed her hand once more over her hearts and bowed her head toward the stars. This time Jonathan did not look away. And far above them, the black armored ships of Earth held the line in silent orbit while dawn climbed over Aurelian and the long work of surviving began.